In this video, we're going to talk about for loops and while loops. For loops are generally considered to be counting loops. So if you know how many times, or if it's based upon how many times you're going to have to do something, or if it's based upon maybe some user input and you know that it's always going to be a certain amount of times, when we get into arrays, you're going to see that we're going to be using for loops pretty significantly. Generally, you're going to use a for loop, all right? So the format for a for loop is as follows. You start off with the keyword for. You have a counting variable with a semicolon, a condition, and an incrementer and a decrementer, or decrementer. Followed by, again, if it's only one statement, you don't need the curly braces, but I will always put them in. These are the statements that are going to be executed as long as this condition continues to be true. So let's look at a simple example. We start off with the keyword for. I define an integer variable, I, and initialize it to be 0. My condition is I'm going to keep looping as long as I is less than 3. And then I increment. Now the thing to remember about for loops and incrementing is this incrementer only gets executed as soon after the statements inside the for loop are executed. So the first time through, I is going to be 0, and it's going to display a 0 since I'm printing out the value of I. Then it increments I, checks to see is I less than 3, prints out 1, increments I to be 2, is 2 less than 3, yes, prints out 2, and then checks, increments I to be 3, is 3 less than 3, no. All right, so that's how a for loop works, and we'll run that in 1 second. While loops are pretty similar. Again, they're very often used to test some sort of condition, sometimes when prompting the user, do you wish to continue? The general format is the keyword while, and then inside parentheses some Boolean or set of Boolean conditions. Inside of a while loop, you can have and operations, you could have or operations. It doesn't matter. You could have as many conditions as you want inside a while loop. That's the benefit of using a while. If all of those Boolean conditions are true, the statements inside the curly braces are executed. Again, if it's only one statement, you don't need those curly braces, but I always put them in for clarification purposes. So in this example, I created a scanner and I said, I'm going to prompt the user to see if they want to continue. So I set the response equal to Y. While response is equal to Y, I prompt the user, do you want to keep looping? All right. I use my console.next.char@0. That's how you get the first character that the user enters in using the scanner. And I store that in the response. Now, remember, an uppercase Y is different from a lowercase y. It has different ASCII values. So what I did here was I used a static method, which we'll talk about later in this unit, and I convert it to uppercase. So the response, whatever the user enters, if they enter in a lowercase y, it's automatically converted to uppercase, and that value is then stored back in response. So when I execute this, you'll see that I have 0, 1, 2, which is the for loop that we talked about, right? It goes through, I is initially 0, is I less than 3, is 0 less than 3, yes, print out 0. Increment I is now 1, is 1 less than 3, yes, print out 1. Increment I is now 2, is 2 less than 3, yes, print out 2. Increment I is 3 less than 3, no, done executing. In my while loop, is response equal to Y? Well, it is initially because that's what I initialized it to be. Prompt the user, do you wish to keep looping? Yes. All right, so when I type in Y, notice it was a lowercase. It said, they said yes. Why? Because it converted that lowercase y to an uppercase. If I put in an uppercase, it's still going to convert it to uppercase even though it's uppercase. All right, if I put in anything else except a y, it's going to convert that to an uppercase, and the execution stops. The other place where a while loop is very useful is to check for a range. So suppose that I said enter system.out.print, enter a value between 1 and 9. Integer user response equals console.nextInt while, and now I want to say, okay, what if the user entered in 0? All right, I want to reprompt them again, and I want to keep reprompting them until they get it right. So I'm going to say while while user response is less than 1, or user response is greater than 9. I need to reprompt them. Now, a lot of people want to put in, when they do a while loop, they want to put in, when it's actually true. That's not what you want. You want to put in when they actually broke the range, right? So they broke the range when the user response is less than 1, and they broke the range when the user response is greater than 9. So I'm going to say system.out.print out of range. Please enter a value between 1 and 9 inclusive. All right, and I'm going to use my user response again, because that's the variable that's being checked. Console.nextInt. And my closing curly braces there. I think I have an extra one. So now I'm going to run this. And it's going through and it's doing all of the stuff that we did before. And do I want to keep looping? I'll say yes for once. And then, 7, which is no. Now it says enter a value between 1 and 9. I'm going to enter in 10. Out of range, enter a value between 1 and 9. Well, assume that I'm stupid, and I enter in 10. 10, 11, 12. Finally, I get it. 5. And it says, that's it. It's done executing. All right, so it's a good policy to use a while loop when you're trying to keep things within a specific range when you're prompting the user. One of the biggest things that you have to protect yourself against is from the user. Because I guarantee the first thing that the user is going to do when they try and enter in a value within a specific range is enter something outside of the range. It happens all of the time. All right, so protecting yourself from the user is one of the key components that you're going to have to learn. Now, this doesn't protect us in the off chance that the user happens to enter in Q instead of 1 and 9. You'll see that that's still going to produce an error. We'll be able to handle that with an exception, with exception handling later on. All right, but for now, while loops used to test conditions or to test ranges. For loops are generally counting loops. For loops can also be what we call nested. So if I said for int, and this could be anything, it doesn't have to be I or J or whatever, counter equals 1, counter less than 2, counter plus plus, for int inner counter equals, let's say, 5, inner counter less than or greater than 0, inner counter minus minus. Notice I could also decrement. All right, so let's display what each of these values are. So counter is going to be the first one. Then I'm going to put a space in there, if I can type. And inner counter is going to be the second one. All right, so now when I execute this, you're going to see that it's going to start off by doing it's 1. Let's make this 3 just to make it easier to see the differences here. All right, so it starts off with 1, and then it goes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then it recounts again and does 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So every time that this inner loop finishes, this outer loop gets incremented by 1, and the inner loop restarts again. Take some time and study this code and figure out how this is working. I found it's very easy to do this as a hand execution exercise. All right, so make certain that you take the time to figure that out. That's pretty much it on for loops and while loops for now. Again, this is hopefully a review for you. If it's not, take some time and make certain that you understand how to use for and while loops, because we will be using them pretty extensively throughout the remainder of the semester. As always, let me know if you have any questions. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about switch statements. A switch statement is a shorthand mechanism of using if, else if, else if, else if, else if, else if, else statements. All right, so if you're finding that you're writing a whole bunch of if statements and it has a countable variable, so if you're saying if the value is 1, if the value is 2, if the value is 3, if the value is 4, etc., this is just a shorthand way of doing it. If you find that you can't swap out a whole bunch of if, else if statements with a switch statement, and you're finding that you're putting a whole bunch of else if statements in your code, take a minute and look at the code and see if there's an easier way of coming up with what you're trying to do. But taking a look at the switch statement, you can see that we start off with the keyword switch, followed by a countable variable. A countable variable is just a variable that is either going to be an integer data type or a character. Could be also a Boolean, but in that case, it doesn't really make sense to have a switch statement. You cannot have something like a double, because somewhere between 1.1 and 1.2, there's 1.11, 1.1111, 1.111112, etc. There's an infinite number of possibilities in between. So this has to be something that's either an integer, a character, a enumeration would work. All right, so it has to be something that's countable. Next, you have the open curly brace followed by the case keyword. Inside parentheses, then, you specify a value, followed by a colon. If the value that's in here matches the value that's in this countable variable, then the statements inside here are executed. Most importantly, don't forget to put this break statement in, because if this value matches what's in the countable variable up here, the statements are executed, and when this break statement hits, execution jumps down to the area immediately following the closing curly brace for the switch statement. If this value does not match what's in here, then you go to the next case statement and it checks that one. If that one matches, then those statements are executed. If it doesn't match, then it checks the next one, and so on. If you get all the way down to the default value, the default value is like the else in an if statement. If you get all the way down to this, if none of these values match what's in the variable up here, then the default gets executed, meaning that there's no match, and sometimes people will just put a statement to indicate that. The break statement in the default is optional, but I always put it in to add inconsistency. So suppose that I had a character variable called grade, and I had the value b inside of it. I start off with my switch statement, and the variable that I'm switching on is grade. We all know that it has a value b in it right now, So it's going to come in, it's going to check the case A, it's going to say your grade is an A, and then break. Right? If it is an A, if it's an A, which we know it's not. So then it's going to come down to the B. If it's a B, it's going to say your grade is a B. You can have as many statements inside your case statement as you want. They don't just have to be system.out.printlines. They could be assignment statements. They could be ifs. They could be loops. It doesn't matter what you put inside. All right? Just because I have system.out.printlines statements in there doesn't mean that that's all that can be in there. So if I run this now, when I run it, it's going to say your grade is a B because that's what's stored in the countable variable grade, which happens to be a B in this case. Note, if you're using integers, you don't put the quotes around it because you're not trying to compare the character integer. You're trying to compare the actual value integer of the integer. All right, so if I change this to a C and execute it, then you'll see that your grade is a C. Now, in the next one, I have case D and case F. This is like an OR statement in an if, in a Java if statement. So if it's either a D or an F, then it's going to do system.out.println, your grade is a D or an F. All right, so if I put in either a D, it's going to say your grade is a D or an F. If I put in an F, again, it's going to say your grade is a D or an F. There is no equivalent to an AND statement, to an if statement with an AND in it in a case statement. You can only do an OR. Finally, if I don't put in any of these values, D, F, A, B, or C, let's say if I put in an E and run it, it's going to say your grade is not provided in the scale. All right, so that's how the case statement works. It's pretty straightforward, I think, and it's a nice shortcut for trying to provide, and if you have a very long if-else-if statement. One thing that I do want to caution you is to remember to put in the break statements. For example, if I take out this case here, that break statement, and I change the value to a C, then when I execute this, it's going to say your grade is a C, your grade is a D or an F. Why? Because there's no way to break out as soon as this case has been executed. So don't forget to put those break statements in. In the next video, I'm going to talk about while loops and for loops.